Okay, let's kick things off. Imagine this runner, right? Covered in dust, feet probably sore, maybe even bleeding a bit, just finished this incredibly tough journey.
Yeah.
But they're not thinking about the pain. They're smiling, beaming, actually, because they have news. The Babylonian exile. It's over. Freedom.
Wow, that's a powerful image.
It is. And that picture from Isaiah 52.7 really sets the scene for our deep dive today. Evangelism. Sharing that incredible, world-changing good news,
Mm-hmm.
the gospel. And, it often mirrors that ancient runner's journey. It can have a real cost, demand sacrifice, serious grit.
It's a really compelling picture, isn't it? And the source material we're digging into today, it captures that same spirit. It paints this vivid picture of what it means to be like a modern gospel envoy,
Yeah.
walking among people who haven't really heard the message accurately.
Mm-hmm.
It just drives home the unique privilege, but also the significant responsibility that comes with being the one carrying that kind of news.
And our mission, really, in this deep dive is to pull out the absolute core insights from this particular text on evangelism. What is that fundamental calling? What are the very real challenges people face out there?
Right.
What different approaches does it talk about? And crucially, what are some practical, usable tips for sharing the gospel, especially when things get tough? We're going to unpack this material and bring the most important bits to you.
Yeah, but we're taking this one source and really exploring what it has to say about this fundamental part of the Christian mission.
So let's jump right in. The source really emphasizes that proclaiming Jesus is central. Why is that so foundational, according to this text?
Well, the source connects it directly to the apostolic calling itself. I mean, it's presented as the driving force behind why people are sent out in the first place.
Okay.
It links this straight back to Romans 10, verses 14 and 15, asking those questions. How can people call on Christ or believe in him or even hear about him if no one is sent to preach?
Right, the beautiful feet idea.
Yeah, exactly. That's where that beautiful feet idea comes from, those who are sent to bring the good news.
Yeah.
It connects that ancient runner imagery directly to Paul's whole argument for why we need to send people.
So someone absolutely has to go. But what's the motivation? What fuels that desire?
The source points straight to Jesus' own heart, just full of compassion for the people all around us.
Mm-hmm.
That compassion is really presented as the deep-down motivation for wanting friends, neighbors, everyone to come to faith. And the text also points out, practically speaking, in those frontier places where there aren't any believers yet, workers actively sharing Christ is usually essential just to get a fellowship or a church planting movement off the ground.
Okay, so here's a really key question the source tackles head on. How will the gospel primarily spread in these cultures, especially those often seen as resistant? Is it through foreign workers or is it local believers?
Yeah, and the source is, well, pretty unambiguous on this. It states very clearly that the spread of the gospel will not primarily happen through foreign.
Really, that direct?
Yes. Its conclusion is that, sooner or later, the local believers themselves are going to be significantly more prolific and, frankly, more effective witnesses than any outsider could be.
That's a powerful statement. Does the source give any, evidence or stories for why it believes locals are that much more effective?
Absolutely. Get some compelling examples. There's this one story from India about a coworker leading a young woman named Ari to faith.
Okay.
Ari then turns around and successfully shares the gospel with the man who becomes her husband. But she doesn't stop there. She goes on to lead 8 other women to Christ, including one woman over 80 years old.
Wow.
And she even baptized them herself. The report makes a point of saying she did all this despite facing a really public confrontation and serious threats from her uncle, who was furious about her faith and her actions.
That single story just shows the incredible multiplication power of local believers, doesn't it? So if locals are the primary multipliers, what role does the source see for foreign workers then?
Well, foreigners are seen as modeling the passion, the practice of evangelism. They show how to share, how to initiate conversations so that the local believers can catch that vision and then take it much, much further within their own culture, their own networks.
That makes a lot of sense, modeling and equipping. And of course, the approach has to adapt, right? Context is huge.
Absolutely. The source really stresses that where you are profoundly impacts how you should approach evangelism. It contrasts working in places where there are already lots of believers there. The focus might be more of a balance between evangelism and discipleship, teaching,
Right.
versus pioneer settings with 0 believers, where direct evangelism becomes the absolute top priority.
And the political or legal situation adds another layer of complexity.
Totally. The source contrasts, say, strictly policed countries where any kind of public evangelism is super risky, could get you kicked out immediately, versus other countries where maybe larger public events are possible. Things like showing the Jesus film, maybe placing newspaper ads, offering free New Testaments, or even holding talks in hotels.
Huge differences. But even with all those variations, Agra, Bandung, Calcutta, Cairo, wherever the source points to one constant opportunity.
Yes, and it's a vital point.
Yeah.
It emphasizes that regardless of the location, the government rules, the cultural barriers, sharing the good news with your friends, your work colleagues, your neighbors, the people you bump into every single day, that's always possible. Nothing should stop you from making those personal connections.
Okay, let's talk methods. The source distinguishes different types of evangelism based on how they connect or don't connect to church planting movements. What does it say about something called pre-evangelism?
Right. Pre-evangelism, as this text defines it, is about aiming for a broader influence on society. The goal is more about making people generally open to the gospel over time, maybe creating a more positive impression of Christ and Christianity. But it's not direct gospel preaching. Not calling for an immediate decision right then and there. The examples it gives are things like certain publications or maybe music projects that have this wider aim. It's valued, sure, for creating a receptive climate, but its contribution to actually planting churches is seen as more general, not direct.
Gotcha. And what about broadcast evangelism?
So this is using media, radio, TV, internet, maybe correspondence courses to sow the seed really widely on a massive scale.
Right.
And the source acknowledges this approach is powerful. God has used it mightily. I mean, countless testimonies of conversion have come through this. However, it makes a really crucial distinction.
Okay.
Its contribution stays general unless, and this is key, unless it includes an effective system for actual on-the-ground follow-up and integration into a local fellowship.
And the source has a fantastic story that really brings that point home, doesn't it? Combining broadcast and that follow-up.
It really does. It tells the story of Joseph, who was a communist official, and his brother Edie, who couldn't read. Edie starts listening to Transworld Radio and requests one of their correspondence courses. Joseph, who'd just gotten out of jail, kind of reluctantly agrees to help his brother read the materials.
Wow.
So a ministry team working with TWR gets Edie's contact details and manages to visit him. That one visit led to Joseph and his entire immediate family, and eventually a lot of his extended family too, coming to faith. Over about 14 years, that initial contact through the radio, combined with that local follow-up, resulted in planting something like 5 fellowships or churches.
That's incredible. It just shows the synergy, right? Linking those two things. So, according to the source, for evangelism to directly contribute to church planting, what 2 specific criteria does it need to meet?
Okay, the text is very specific here. First, the workers involved need to be able personally to lead local individuals to faith and then help them confirm that new relationship with Christ.
Okay, personal involvement.
Right. And second, those same workers need to be able, over time, to actually baptize these new disciples and teach them to obey all of Christ's commands. And importantly, that includes helping them become part of a functioning fellowship or church.
Got it. So based on those 2 criteria, which approaches does the source see as fitting the bill for direct church planting?
Well, friendship evangelism, personally sharing with your friends and contacts, that clearly fits.
Makes sense.
And the source also says that various forms of what it calls apostolic evangelism, which it describes as projects aimed at broader sowing, can also lead directly to church planting.
Okay, let's dig into the challenges now, because the source is very realistic about encountering resistance, especially in certain cultures or people groups.
Yeah, it doesn't pull any punches there. It lists contexts often seen as resistant places, predominantly Buddhist, Hindu, Muslim, or various tribal groups. It specifically mentions examples like Chinese Buddhists and Japan as being particularly challenging fields historically.
But it also presents this striking kind of good news, bad news scenario, specifically about the Muslim world. What's the good news it highlights there?
The good news, according to the source, is that it claims more Muslims are turning to Christ worldwide right now than maybe ever before in history.
Wow.
It gives an estimate of perhaps 2 million Muslims coming to faith in recent years, citing reports of significant movements happening in places like North Africa, Central Asia, one specific Asian Muslim country it mentions, and also Iran. A lot of workers today apparently feel like they're finally seeing the harvest from years and years of previous sowing.
That's incredibly encouraging. So what's the bad news then, the flip side?
Well, the sobering reality is that 2 million while amazing, is still a tiny fraction compared to the, 1.2 billion Muslims globally.
Right.
The vast majority in these unreached people groups still haven't had a real chance to hear the true message of Jesus, or they live within belief systems that effectively, prevent them from even considering it fairly.
And the source is very honest about the personal toll this takes, the challenge for many workers. Particularly, it mentions the Middle East and North Africa.
Oh, definitely. It highlights that many really dedicated workers there are seeing very, very limited fruit, sometimes after 15 years or even longer of consistent patient ministry. Some apparently haven't even found one truly open seeker yet.
That must be incredibly difficult.
Yeah, the source describes it as a uniquely difficult task.
Mm-hmm.
How do you maintain that expectancy, keep sharing Jesus, when you personally are seeing almost no visible response?
It sounds like it would be so easy to feel like a failure in that situation.
And that's exactly the perspective the source pushes back against, hard. It uses that historical example of the first attempt to build the Panama Canal by the French. A massive loss of life, huge amounts of money, wasted, undeniably a human failure. But the source argues, spiritual work among the unreached, even if you don't see visible results in this lifetime, is not a failure in God's eyes. It calls it absolutely precious in His sight and says it will be seen in eternity as a wonderful success of obedience.
That's a powerful reframing.
It is. And it offers that well-known saying, evangelism is sharing Jesus Christ in the power of the Holy Spirit and leaving the results to God. That obedience, the source insists, is never failure.
Okay, so if the lack of visible results isn't failure, the question is still there. Why is the resistance so strong in some places? The source lists several factors, calling them the usual suspects.
Right. It starts with what it just calls normal spiritual stuff. This covers the reality that people influenced by spiritual forces, a prince of the power of the air, as Paul puts it. There's also just a natural human inertia, right? People resist radical spiritual change. And ultimately, the source says, a sovereign work of the Holy Spirit and a personal encounter with God are necessary for people's spiritual eyes to be opened.
So there's a deep spiritual battle going on. What about more tangible, earthly obstacles?
Yeah, then it talks about barriers to hearing. Governments in many restricted areas create huge obstacles. Foreigners might be denied entry if they're suspected of planning to preach. Local Christians can face actual legal prohibitions against sharing their faith openly.
Wow.
Believers often face severe social consequences, legal repercussions. However, the source does point out that sharing your personal testimony one-on-one is often permitted in more places than you might think.
Okay.
And critically, the text states its belief pretty strongly that unjust legal restrictions specifically designed to stop the spread of the gospel must be disobeyed. The message should be proclaimed, even if it means risking expulsion, prison, or even death.
That's a very bold stance on obedience to God over human law. Beyond legal barriers, what about theological reasons for resistance?
Well, people don't hear the gospel in a vacuum, right? They have existing beliefs. In many Muslim cultures, for instance, people are raised with very specific, often inaccurate, ideas about Christianity, claims like Jesus didn't truly die on the cross, or that the New Testament has been corrupted over time, and that salvation comes only through their own good deeds and religious practices.
But you mentioned earlier the source suggests the message of grace can actually be attractive in that context. How does that work against those ingrained beliefs?
Exactly. Because their traditional teaching often focuses so heavily on earning God's favor through works, the Christian message of justification by grace through faith in a crucified and risen Savior is actually a really stark contrast. It can be surprisingly appealing.
I see.
It offers a completely different path to a relationship with God. But it does mean gospel messengers need to be prepared to gently but clearly address those common theological objections.
What other factors does the source point to that make people resistant?
Complacency comes up as a big one, often highlighted as maybe the biggest reason. People just feel they don't need Christ because they believe, based on their current religion or culture, that they're already on the right path. They'll be fine eternally. The source uses the example of places like the Arab Gulf, where strong religious orthodoxy, combined with, frankly, economic prosperity from oil wealth, can significantly reduce people's perceived needs and kind of stifle concerns about sin or their eternal future.
Makes sense?
Also, a widespread belief in some form of purgatory can lessen the fear of hell, which reduces any sense of urgency about finding certain salvation now.
And there's that striking story illustrating this kind of complacency.
Yeah, the story of Bob meeting a man on a bus in Turkey. This man was talking about his belief in purgatory and casually estimated it would probably take him several 100,000 years there to pay off his sins. When Blab shared the good news of free salvation through Christ, the man just politely declined, saying something like he'd rather work it off himself in purgatory. It's a powerful, if a bit disheartening picture of that deep-seated complacency.
And then there's the final, maybe most obvious and terrifying reason for resistance.
Right. To become a follower is too costly. The potential price tag is incredibly high in many places. Severe persecution, public ridicule, arrest, long prison sentences, even death. The source notes that the fear of these consequences, and sometimes outright threats, prevent many people who might otherwise be open from taking steps of faith or even witnessing to their own families.
Those are just tremendous obstacles for anyone to face.
They really are, and the source doesn't try to minimize them at all. But it intentionally ends this whole section on resistance on a note of hope. It reiterates that despite all these profound difficulties, God is actively moving across the unreached world in ways perhaps never seen before. There's this tangible sense of expectancy because of what the Spirit is doing.
That hopeful note is so important. Okay, let's shift gears now to the really practical side. The source offers 17, count them, 17 perspectives and tips aimed especially at those of us who might not feel like we're naturally gifted evangelists. How does it frame evangelism overall?
It kind of breaks it down into three key things. First, obviously sharing Christ. Second, intentionally looking for those individuals whom God might already be preparing, getting ready to know him. And third, praying constantly for power, for boldness, for guidance from the Spirit, and for spiritual eyes to be opened in the people you meet.
So it's not just about what you say, but also this active looking and the absolute necessity of prayer. What are some of the standout tips from this big list?
Well, number one is fundamental. Pray. It calls it the essential first step. And the source shares some powerful examples. There's this Operation 3 project in Kazakhstan, where team members specifically prayed for 3 non-believing friends each. The result, about 60% of those friends came to faith in under 6 months.
60%.
Yeah. And it also mentions a prayer project that focused on an entire country in North Africa. That focused prayer effort apparently led to over 100 new believers and 6 new fellowships forming. So prayer works.
For individuals and for broader movements. Incredible. What's another key perspective it offers?
Remembering God's elect in your city. It draws on what the Lord told Paul in Corinth. Remember, I have many people in this city.
Right, Acts 18.
Exactly. The source anchors on this biblical truth, saying, hey, this is true of every city globally. It encourages workers to really take hold of this promise. God has people ready to hear his voice right where you are.
And it pushes back against a common hang-up, at least in some Western cultures.
Yes, tip 3. It's not taboo to talk about spiritual matters. The source contrasts that Western reluctance, where we often feel awkward bringing up religion, with the often surprising openness in many other cultures. It mentions Arab countries specifically, where spiritual discussions are actually common and often welcomed. That perceived barrier just isn't there everywhere.
Okay, so if you're looking for those people God is preparing, seeking divine guidance seems pretty crucial.
Absolutely. Tip 4 is seek the Spirit's guidance. The Spirit can sovereignly lead you to specific open individuals. It tells the story from India about a worker who felt this distinct prompting to approach a man named Irrawadi. Turned out, Irrawadi was actively waiting, almost praying, for someone spiritual to enter his life. It's a powerful example of that sovereign leading.
What about being bold? That feels necessary given all the challenges and resistance we just talked about.
For sure. Tip 5 is basically be bold. The source argues that bolder, maybe more prophetic witness is often more effective than being overly cautious or timid. It stresses the need to speak not just to people's minds, but also to their hearts and their wills. It notes that the apostles in the New Testament included an element of warning, right? About the consequences of rejecting the gospel. And the source suggests we shouldn't shy away from that necessary truth just out of politeness. It quotes Greg Livingston saying his aim is for a Muslim friend to understand that if the gospel is true, it's the best news ever, but if they turn away, the consequences could be, well, terrible. We're called to be God's ambassadors, speaking with truth and authority.
So boldness is key, but how does that work for people with different personalities or gifts? Not everyone is naturally outspoken.
Right, and tips 6 and 7 get into that. Try different ways and work in your particular giftings. Sharing Christ isn't just one thing. It involves lots of facets, meeting people, building rapport, turning conversations towards spiritual things, clearly explaining the gospel message, sometimes apologetics, hospitality.
Lots of pieces.
Exactly. We don't all have to do everything equally well. The source gives examples of teams where members complemented each other beautifully. Like maybe great relationship builders needed others who were better skilled at explaining doctrine clearly, or couples who needed help with hospitality. The point is, if you don't feel you have the gift of evangelism, use the gifts you do have, maybe a teaching gift. Use it evangelistically.
Preparation comes up too. It's not just about relying on the Spirit without doing our homework.
Yes, tip 8, get prepared. Victory comes from God, absolutely. But that doesn't excuse us from doing our part in preparation. This means getting training, reading books that help you understand local beliefs. It uses Buddhism as an example, which the source says builds both your confidence and your faith. We need to always be ready, like 1 Peter 3.15 says, to give a defense for the hope we have. Be prepared for the main objections you're likely to hear. The source even quotes John Stott, cautioning against using the Holy Spirit as an excuse for being lazy in our preparation.
There's an interesting point about relationships and when to share the gospel. It kind of challenges a common idea.
Yeah, tip 9 goes right after the notion that you must cultivate a long-term, deep relationship first to sort of win the right to be heard before you can share the gospel message.
Right, I've heard that a lot.
Me too.
Yeah.
But the source calls this generally a myth and argues it's largely unbiblical. It points out that Jesus and Paul often shared about the kingdom much earlier in their interactions with people, not typically after years of just building rapport.
Huh. That's counterintuitive for some of us. What about language skills? How important are they?
Crucial. Tip 10 is grow in the language. Having a weak grasp of the local language is presented as a major obstacle. Strong language proficiency is seen as absolutely key for building deep relationships, having meaningful spiritual conversations, and it significantly boosts your confidence and faith in ministry too. While God can certainly work through translators, personal proficiency is generally essential for long-term effectiveness.
And who you spend your time with. It suggests not limiting your circle.
Exactly. Tip 11. Don't limit yourself relationally. It says a common mistake workers make is only investing their time and witness in a very small circle of close friends. The source strongly encourages continually meeting new people through all sorts of activities, joining clubs, hanging out at coffee houses, through your job, kids' school events, whatever basically, casting a wider net to discover who might be open. It also suggests that seeking out people similar to yourself often works best initially. And it notes cultural differences too, like how the Western habit of couple-to-couple socializing isn't the norm everywhere.
There's a specific tip aimed at men.
Yeah, tip 12. Men work outside the home. Basically, in many cultures, men's primary social interactions happen in the workplace or other public spaces, not usually in the home. So the source advises male workers to try and establish some kind of base, like an office or a workshop outside their home. Spending all day at home can seem strange in some contexts and really limit opportunities for connecting with other local men.
Okay, what about practical tools for actually sharing the message itself?
Tip 13 highlights using things like the Discovery course or other types of investigative Bible studies. The source specifically mentions the Discovery course as a really useful tool, noting that people are often surprisingly receptive to an invitation like, hey, would you be interested in a 6-part study on Alma-See Christ from the New Testament? And it shares this great story of Mike and an ice cream vendor who started watching the video version. They were apparently so captivated they watched all 6 parts right there in one sitting, and the vendor gave his heart to Christ that very day.
Wow, just like that. That shows the power of the tool and God's timing. What about prayer for physical needs? Does that play a role?
Definitely. Tip 14 is pray for the sick in Jesus' name. The source points out that many significant people movements throughout history have actually begun with people first witnessing Jesus' power as a healer.
Interesting.
It even offers a practical suggestion for how to offer prayer for healing or other concerns. Basically, ask if they believe Jesus healed the sick when he was on earth. Ask where they think he is now. Answer, alive with God. Then explain that he instructed his followers to pray for the sick in his name, and then ask, would it be okay if I prayed for your specific illness or need right now?
That's a helpful, non-threatening way to offer. Okay, here's one that feels pretty bold, bringing up Jesus early on, like in the first meeting.
Yeah, tip 15, bring up Jesus in the first 30 minutes. The source actually draws on some sociological insights here, suggesting that we tend to reveal what's most important to us early on when we meet someone new.
Makes sense.
So if Jesus is truly central in our lives, some reference to him should probably emerge naturally pretty early. Veteran workers apparently often find it gets much harder to bring him up later if you wait too long. It shares a story of a team in Asia who were quite upfront about the gospel. Some people felt they were being maybe too visible, too risky initially, but the result was that new believers started seeking them out because they knew exactly who to go to and what these people stood for.
Okay, for someone listening who feels maybe overwhelmed by all this or maybe discouraged by past lack of results, is there like a minimum starting point suggested?
Yes, absolutely. Tip 16 offers 4 doable steps for anyone feeling that way. Kind of a minimal plan to get back in the game. It's simple. 1, pray daily specifically for opportunities to share. 2, spend intentional time actively meeting people or just being with non-believers. 3, make it a habit to ask questions about important heart matters in their lives. And 4, don't be surprised when God actually answers your prayers and opens a door. The source says basically anyone can commit to doing just those 4 things.
That feels manageable. And finally, bringing it back to that perspective on results.
Right. Tip 17. Rejoice that the results are in God's hands. We sow so many seeds, and the reality is we often don't get to see all the fruit that comes from our efforts. Not seeing immediate or visible results doesn't mean your sowing wasn't precious or that fruit isn't happening somewhere else, maybe down the line.
Mm-hmm.
The source shares this wonderful, unexpected story about Liz. Years after doing college ministry in Egypt, she met a woman named Fiza in the U.S. It turned out that the New Testament Liz had given Fiza way back then had been read. Fiza came to faith through it and eventually led her own family to the Lord.
Incredible.
Yeah. Liz had no idea until that chance meeting years later. The source reminds us that much of the fruit from our labor will only be known when we get to heaven.
Those tips are just incredibly helpful, so practical and encouraging. Now, you mentioned apostolic evangelism earlier when we were talking about approaches that directly lead to church planting. Let's revisit that. How does the source really differentiate apostolic evangelism from the friendship evangelism we just talked so much about?
Well, the key point the source makes is that friendship evangelism, while absolutely vital, wasn't actually the primary model of evangelism used by the apostles themselves in the New Testament.
So, okay.
The apostolic approach, as presented in Acts, was often characterized by reaching larger numbers of people at once, casting a much broader net through things like public preaching and various other methods. Even when they reached individuals, those individuals were often gateways to wider social or family networks.
So it's really about wider sowing, aiming for quantity in a sense, not just deep one-on-one relationships.
Exactly. It's about reaching more people initially. And the source highlights that its own organizational experience actually confirms this. It says fruit often comes from these outreaches further afield, not exclusively from your immediate close friends and neighbors.
Interesting.
It shares this specific example of church planters who lived in one neighborhood for 8 years. They shared faithfully with practically everyone they could there, but all their actual disciple-making fruit, the people who came to faith and formed churches, came from people they met and shared with outside that immediate neighborhood.
Wow, that's a really counterintuitive finding for many, I think. So how does the source define this apostolic evangelism more formally then?
It defines it as the exposing of many to the gospel in order to find the few who are spiritually responsive.
Okay, finding the persons of peace, maybe.
Kind of like that, yeah. Finding those God has prepared. A sister organization quoted in the source calls it simply any bold evangelism outside your neighborhood. Another definition offered is evangelism by a group, to win a group. The key element seems to be that it typically involves some kind of program, a plan, or an event designed to reach multiple people simultaneously or in a focused campaign.
What kind of events or programs are we talking about? Give us some examples.
Sure. Examples from the source include things like dedicated follow-up efforts for people who respond to radio programs or internet outreach, hosting public events, maybe with a guest speaker, or events centered around Christian holidays like Christmas or Easter, organizing specific events where prayer for the sick is offered publicly, or even using things like community surveys as a way to initiate lots of conversations about spiritual matters and create opportunities to share Christ more broadly.
That servant evangelism story from Sri Lanka you mentioned earlier feels like a perfect illustration of this kind of approach in action.
It absolutely is.
Huh.
This team in Sri Lanka decided to do some servant evangelism by cleaning up a really neglected park area. They were even warned there might be unexploded landmines there.
Seriously?
Yeah. But they started the work anyway.
Mhm.
And soon, local people saw what they were doing and began joining in, helping out. This naturally opened up relationships. They eventually brought in a bulldozer to clear space for a volleyball court, organized a tournament that even drew in a local political group.
Wow.
And this whole practical, community-focused effort became the catalyst for a much wider, very fruitful church planting effort in that whole part of the city. It started with a bold, planned, group-oriented event outside their immediate friendship circle.
Why does the source suggest this apostolic approach is particularly reinvigorating for workers?
Well, for several key reasons. First, it's seen as highly effective at finding God's elect, those people who are genuinely spiritually responsive. The logic is, if only a small percentage of the population is truly open at any given time, you need broader nets to find them efficiently.
Makes sense.
Second, it's considered essential for sparking church planting movements, or CPMs. The source references David Garrison's work and the principle of abundant evangelism, or over-sowing, like how nature produces thousands of seeds just for one tree to eventually grow. You need to sow broadly.
Okay.
And third, it provides really meaningful opportunities for effective ministry for team members who may not feel particularly gifted or comfortable with strictly one-on-one personal evangelism. It leverages different gifts.
Does this strong emphasis on apostolic evangelism mean that friendship evangelism is, less important or secondary?
Not at all. And the source is really careful to make this point clear. It explicitly states that apostolic evangelism does not replace personal friendship evangelism. Our love for our friends and neighbors still compels us to share with them personally. Friendship evangelism is also vital for modeling how to share for new believers to learn from. And critically, especially in hostile or difficult contexts, most foreign workers probably need to spend their first few years focused primarily on learning the language, understanding the culture, building trust, often mainly through friendship evangelism, before larger-scale, more public apostolic efforts are even feasible or wise.
But even apostolic evangelism, as you said, requires boldness and can involve significant risk, especially in hostile places.
It certainly can. The source fully acknowledges the real possibilities: arrest, jail time, getting expelled from the country, or potentially even worse. But it maintains that, biblically speaking, these potential negative outcomes are not presented as reasons not to proclaim Jesus. Strategic and tactical wisdom is absolutely necessary, of course, but God provides the needed boldness. And the source emphasizes that despite these dangers, various forms of apostolic evangelism are successfully happening right now across the 1040 window, even in places where you might automatically assume it would be completely impossible.
This kind of frontline work naturally brings up a lot of questions. The source touches on a few common FAQs towards the end. For example, is supernatural ministry like healings or miracles always necessary for people to come to faith?
Yeah, the source's perspective on that is interesting. It says that while many people do come to faith after experiencing or witnessing something supernatural like a healing or a significant dream, it's not presented as essential for most workers or most converts. The author of the source actually notes that, personally, they hear of more people trusting Christ simply after reading the New Testament for themselves than specifically because of miracles, although God definitely uses both powerfully.
Okay. What about the idea of focusing only on reaching whole groups, like families or clans, versus trying to win individuals?
The source says, basically, any kind of genuine witness is good. While some strategies do focus on reaching whole family or clan units together, the source points out that in their specific experience, when an extended family is won to Christ, it almost always starts with one or two key individuals within that family believing first. It calls this the Gideon factor.
Ah, okay.
So there remains a vital role for intentionally seeking to win individuals, with the goal then being to work with them to reach their wider network.
And the question of coupling witness with humanitarian work or community development, is that an absolute must?
The source's answer is no, not as some kind of universal biblical rule or strategic requirement. However, it readily acknowledges that doing humanitarian work can be a specific leading from God for certain people or teams. And it certainly demonstrates compassion and has often been used by God to open hearts and doors. It really depends on the specific context and the calling of the worker or the team involved.
Okay, here's a sensitive one. Is there a place for, critical witness about other holy books, like the Quran?
This one gets a yes and no answer in the source. It suggests that some individuals might be genuinely open to questioning their own religious texts, and in those specific cases, some critical engagement might be appropriate, if done very carefully. But as a general approach, being overly critical of other religions can often be counterproductive, can shut down conversations, It's usually more effective to focus on the positive truth and the beauty of Christ and the gospel. The source quotes Greg Livingston again here, emphasizing that you shouldn't unfairly criticize another religion without also acknowledging any positive aspects it might contain, or, importantly, without acknowledging the failings and inconsistencies within Christianity's own history or practice. It requires a lot of skill and wisdom.
And related to that, what about actually quoting verses from the people's own holy book in your witnessing? Is that helpful or problematic?
This is seen as tricky, with good arguments on both sides.
Mm-hmm.
Those who advocate for it say, well, it starts where the friend is, using concepts familiar to them, and their book might contain some positive views on Jesus or other helpful starting points. Those who are against it worry that using the other book might imply it has the same authority as the Bible, and they argue that the Bible itself is sufficient. The source basically concludes there are valid points on both sides. Effectively using verses from another holy book definitely requires significant skill and depends a lot on the specific gifts and discernment of the worker.
Wow, that covers a huge amount of ground from just this one source, from the absolute core calling to the really tough challenges and these very practical approaches.
It really does provide a remarkably comprehensive overview, doesn't it? Offering both deep perspective and a lot of practical encouragement for this absolutely vital work.
And the source's conclusion really ties it all together with this powerful call to action, referencing Matthew 7, verses 7 and 8. Ask, and it will be given to you. Seek, and you will find. Knock, and the door will be open to you. It suggests Jesus wasn't just limiting that to prayer, but maybe to a whole approach to life and ministry.
Exactly, a go-for-it approach. Seeing what needs to be done to reach the unreached, and then just stepping out and doing it by faith, even when the obstacles seem completely insurmountable, and there are tons of perfectly rational reasons to just stop or play it safe.
It gives several great biblical examples of this kind of determined, maybe even audacious faith.
Yeah, it mentions the leper who just pushed through the crowd, breaking all the rules just to touch Jesus.
Yeah.
Or those friends who were so determined to get their paralyzed buddy to Jesus that they literally cut a hole through someone's roof when the door was blocked.
Huh. Yeah.
The Roman centurion whose extraordinary faith Jesus himself commended. And Jonathan, Saul's son, remember him, stepping out with just his armor-bearer against a whole Philistine garrison, saying, "Perhaps the Lord will work for us, for the Lord is not restrained to save by many or by few." That kind of faith.
And there's a vivid modern story from the source, too, that really embodies this go-for-it spirit today.
Oh, it's a powerful one. It's about a friend of the author who somehow received this large circus-style tent in a very unreached, highly restricted country.
Okay.
Instead of seeing all the impossible barriers, getting permission, security risks, etc., he and his team just went for it. They pitched the tent. And hundreds of people from the majority religion came, filled it up, wanting to hear the gospel message. Many were saved.
Incredible.
They faced serious threats, including men actually showing up with machine guns at one point. But they boldly talked them down, apparently. Then, when heavy rain made the tent site unusable, they didn't just quit. They simply went and asked the regional religious cleric for permission to use a community center instead. And remarkably, the cleric granted it.
That is just an amazing example of ignoring all the conventional wisdom about what was supposedly too dangerous or completely impossible.
Exactly. And the source reflects on this, saying that most people, when they encounter a big obstacle or something really frightening, their instinct is just to stop.
Yeah, that's human nature.
Right. But God, the source suggests, might actually be using these very situations to teach his people to react differently, to learn to press forward by faith, remembering that he loves to use the weakness of the world and he delights in rewarding that kind of prevailing, persistent faith.
So after digging into all of this, what does it mean for you, the person listening right now?
Well, this deep dive into the source material has definitely shown us the immense challenges, hasn't it? But also the incredible possibilities out there and the unchanging nature of this core call to share the good news. It really emphasizes that God is moving and the harvest is ripe.
And the message isn't that you have to suddenly become some kind of super gifted, extroverted evangelist overnight. It's really about prayer. It's about intentionally looking for opportunities. And it's about taking those intentional steps, whether they feel big or small, often just stepping a little bit outside your normal comfort zone.
Precisely. It's about responding to that call with courage, yes, but also with deep dependency on the Holy Spirit to empower you.
So here's a final thought for you to mull over, drawing from everything we've unpacked today. As you're willing to take just one step, maybe even a small one, out of your comfort zone in the coming days or weeks, How might the power of the Holy Spirit work uniquely through you to bring in the harvest, even in ground that feels incredibly hard or resistant all around you? Because, as this source powerfully reminds us, the time of harvest among all peoples has truly arrived.